The sun hung high over Riverside Heights on what seemed like just another peaceful Saturday afternoon. The neighborhood was exactly what you picture when someone mentions the nice part of town: perfectly trimmed lawns, kids riding their bikes, and parents chatting on their front porches while sipping fresh lemonade. Officer Keller was new to the police force, having joined just 2 years ago. He sat in his patrol car, drumming his fingers on the steering wheel as his eyes scanned the streets. Being a police officer had been his dream since childhood, but lately his fellow officers had started noticing something concerning about his approach to the job. He was always trying to prove himself, always looking for that big moment that would make his superiors notice him. The thing about Officer Keller was that he took every little rule extremely seriously. If someone's grass was an inch too tall, or if a kid's lemonade stand didn't have a permit, he'd be there with his ticket book ready. His supervisor had already talked to him twice about using better judgment, but Keller insisted he was just doing his job by the book. As he drove past the community park, the crown jewel of Riverside Heights, everything looked normal at first. The park was beautiful that day, with its newly planted flower gardens adding splashes of color everywhere you looked. Parents pushed strollers along the winding paths while elderly couples sat on benches enjoying the warm afternoon breeze. Then something caught his eye. Near the edge of the prize-winning community garden, a young black girl in a bright yellow dress was reaching for some flowers. She couldn't have been more than 9 or 10 years old, and she was carefully selecting blooms of different colors, creating what looked like a small bouquet in her hands. Keller's mind immediately went to the worst possible scenario. He didn't stop to think that maybe she had permission, or that she might have a good reason for picking those flowers. All he saw was someone destroying public property, as he would later write in his report. He pulled his patrol car to a sudden stop, causing a few nearby birds to scatter. The park had recently installed new security cameras, and several people were around with their phones out, enjoying the beautiful day. Nobody seemed concerned about the little girl picking flowers, nobody except Officer Keller. The girl was so focused on carefully selecting each flower that she didn't notice the police car or the officer approaching her with quick, determined steps. She was humming a tune to herself, probably thinking about whoever was going to receive her thoughtfully arranged bouquet. What the officer didn't know, and what would soon turn his ordinary afternoon into a life-changing disaster, was that this little girl wasn't just any resident of Riverside Heights. He also didn't know that several park visitors had already started recording with their phones, sensing that something wasn't right about how intensely this officer was approaching such a young child. The little girl finally noticed the shadow falling over her and looked up, her bright smile quickly fading as she saw the stern-faced officer towering over her. She still held the small bouquet in her hands, a mix of yellow daisies and purple wildflowers that she had so carefully chosen. What happened next would not only shake the entire police department, but would also force the community to confront some uncomfortable truths about power, prejudice, and what it means to protect and serve. The warm afternoon breeze continued to blow through the park, carrying the sweet scent of the flowers. But the peaceful atmosphere was about to shatter, and Officer Keller's next actions would set in motion a chain of events that no one in Riverside Heights would ever forget. The tension in the park rose as Officer Keller stood over the little girl, his shadow blocking out the warm afternoon sun. "What do you think you're doing?" he demanded, his voice sharp enough to make nearby parents turn their heads. The little girl, still holding her carefully gathered flowers, looked up at him with confusion in her eyes. "I'm picking flowers for my mom's birthday," she explained softly, her voice steady despite the officer's intimidating presence. She held up her small bouquet as proof, the yellow daisies and purple wildflowers looking delicate in her tiny hands. "She loves flowers, and I wanted to surprise her." But Officer Keller wasn't interested in her explanation. His face hardened as he reached for his handcuffs, the metal glinting in the sunlight. "You're vandalizing public property," he stated flatly. "That's against the law." The absurdity of the situation. A grown police officer preparing to handcuff a child for picking flowers drew gasps from onlookers. By now, a small crowd had gathered, their phones recording everything. A woman pushing a stroller stepped forward, trying to intervene. "Officer, she's just a little girl picking flowers. Surely this isn't necessary." But Keller waved her off, completely caught up in his misguided sense of duty. The little girl remained surprisingly composed, showing a maturity far beyond her years. "Sir," she said politely, even as tears began to well up in her eyes, "my daddy says I should always stay calm when talking to police officers. Can I please call him? He can explain everything." But Officer Keller was already reciting the Miranda rights, his voice mechanical and cold. The crowd grew larger, their murmurs of disapproval getting louder. Some people were already making phone calls, their urgent whispers carrying across the previously peaceful park. "Turn around," Keller ordered, reaching for the little girl's wrists. The flowers fell from her hands, scattering across the ground, yellow petals against green grass, a sad sight that someone in the crowd later described as the moment innocence met injustice. As he began to place the handcuffs on her small wrists, the little girl didn't cry out or resist. Instead, she stood there with dignity, her chin held high even as tears rolled down her cheeks. The handcuffs were clearly too big for her, looking ridiculous and wrong on her tiny arms. One elderly man in the crowd couldn't contain himself anymore. "Have you lost your mind?" he called out. "She's a child. This is what you think protecting and serving looks like." Others joined in, their voices rising in protest, but Officer Keller seemed to have tunnel vision, focused only on completing his arrest. He reached for his radio, and that's when everything started to unravel. "Dispatch, this is Officer Keller. I have one in custody for vandalism of public property at Riverside Heights Park." There was a long pause before the dispatcher responded, their voice carrying a note of disbelief. The crowd had swelled to over 30 people now, all watching in horror as this scene unfolded. Parents pulled their children close, trying to shield them from watching another child being treated this way. The little girl stood there, handcuffed but unbroken, occasionally glancing at the scattered flowers at her feet. What Officer Keller didn't realize was that several of the onlookers recognized the little girl. They knew exactly who she was, and more importantly, who her father was. Some were already making frantic phone calls, their voices urgent and angry as they reported what was happening. The park's security cameras captured everything: the unnecessary confrontation, the dropped flowers, the two big handcuffs on tiny wrists. Later, these images would become powerful symbols in a larger conversation about police conduct and racial bias. A police cruiser pulled into the park, its arrival sending ripples through the crowd. But this wasn't the backup Officer Keller had been expecting. The door opened, and out stepped a senior officer who took one look at the scene and immediately recognized the magnitude of Keller's mistake. The next few moments would change everything, not just for Officer Keller and the little girl, but for the entire police department and community. The consequences of his actions were about to come crashing down, and not even his badge could protect him from what was coming next. The warm afternoon had turned heavy with tension, the once peaceful park now a stage for a drama that would soon make headlines across the country. And through it all, those scattered flowers lay on the ground, silent witnesses to a moment when authority lost its way and innocence stood its ground. The senior officer stepped out of his cruiser, taking in the scene before him with growing disbelief. 20 years on the force had taught him a lot, but nothing could have prepared him for what he was seeing. A 9-year-old girl in handcuffs, scattered flowers at her feet, and a crowd of angry onlookers with their phones raised. It was like something out of a nightmare. "Officer Keller," he called out, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. As he approached, recognition dawned in his eyes. He knew this little girl. Everyone at the station knew her. She was the police chief's daughter, the same girl who would sometimes bring homemade cookies to the station with her dad, the one who decorated the Christmas tree in the station lobby last December. The color drained from Officer Keller's face as the senior officer drew closer. It started as a slight paleness around his lips, then spread until he looked almost ghostly. The realization of what he'd done, who he'd just handcuffed, hit him like a physical blow. "Sir, I was just—" Keller started to explain, but his voice trailed off. There was no explanation that could make this right. The senior officer was already pulling out his keys to remove the handcuffs, his movements gentle as he approached the little girl. "Hey there, sweetheart," the senior officer said softly, kneeling down to her level. "Let's get these off you, okay?" As he removed the handcuffs, he noticed the red marks they'd left on her small wrists. The sight made his stomach turn. "Your dad's already on his way." The crowd had gone quiet now, watching this new development with intense interest. The only sounds were the chirping of birds and the distant laughter of children from the playground, a harsh contrast to the serious scene unfolding near the flower garden. That's when they heard it, the unmistakable sound of tires screeching to a halt in the parking lot. The police chief's car had arrived, and the air seemed to grow thicker with anticipation. Officer Keller's hands started to shake. He'd heard stories about the chief's calm demeanor, about how he never lost his cool, but he'd also heard about what happened when someone crossed a line with his family. The chief emerged from his car, still in his civilian clothes. It was his day off, after all. He was supposed to be celebrating his wife's birthday with his family. Instead, he was here, walking toward the scene with measured steps that seemed to echo through the park. The crowd parted like water, creating a path for him. Some people were still recording, capturing this moment that would soon become much bigger than just a local incident. The chief's face was a mask of controlled emotion as he took in the scene. His daughter standing there rubbing her wrists, the scattered flowers, and Officer Keller looking like he wanted the ground to swallow him whole. "Daddy," the little girl called out, her composure finally breaking as she ran to her father. The chief caught her in his arms, holding her close as she buried her face in his shirt. For a moment, he wasn't the police chief. He was just a father comforting his scared child. But when he looked up at Officer Keller, the father and the chief merged into something formidable. His voice, when he finally spoke, was quiet but carried across the entire area. "Officer Keller, stay right where you are." The words might have been simple, but they carried the weight of authority and barely contained fury. The chief turned to the senior officer. "I want his body camera footage secured immediately. All of it." Then he looked at the crowd, noting all the phones recording the scene. "I appreciate everyone's concern. If anyone has video of this incident from the beginning, please stay and speak with Officer Chen here. Your footage will be important." Officer Keller stood rooted to the spot, watching as his career crumbled around him. His breathing had become shallow, and sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool breeze. This wasn't supposed to happen. He was supposed to be enforcing the law, doing his job, making a difference. Instead, he just made the biggest mistake of his career. The chief picked up one of the fallen flowers, a yellow daisy that had somehow remained intact. He handed it to his daughter, who took it with a small smile. "Were these for Mom's birthday?" he asked gently. When she nodded, he looked back at Officer Keller, and his expression hardened again. The contrast was striking. A tender moment between father and daughter set against the backdrop of what was about to become a departmental earthquake. The chief's next words were directed at Officer Keller, but they carried across the park for everyone to hear. "You and I are about to have a very long conversation about what just happened here. And believe me, you're going to wish these flowers were the biggest problem you had today." Officer Keller's face crumpled, and for the first time, tears began to well up in his eyes. The reality of his actions, and their consequences, was finally hitting him full force. In just a few minutes, he'd managed to destroy his career, traumatize a child, and spark what would become a national conversation about police conduct and racial bias. The warm afternoon sun continued to shine down on the park, indifferent to the drama unfolding below. The scattered flowers lay as silent witnesses to a moment when authority had lost its way, and justice was about to take a very personal turn. Time seemed to stand still in Riverside Heights Park as everyone watched the scene unfold. The chief knelt beside his daughter, gently wiping tears from her cheeks with his thumb. His touch was tender, but everyone could see the storm brewing in his eyes. This was a father who had just found his little girl in handcuffs for picking birthday flowers. "Baby girl," he said softly, his voice carrying in the hushed park. "I need you to go with Officer Chen for a few minutes. He's going to take some pictures of your wrists and ask you what happened. Can you be brave for me one more time?" His daughter nodded, straightening her yellow dress before walking over to the senior officer, her head held high despite everything. The crowd watched in silence as the chief slowly rose to his feet. The transformation was something to behold, from gentle father to commanding officer in the blink of an eye. He turned to face Officer Keller, who had started trembling visibly. "Sir, I can explain," Keller stammered, his voice cracking. "I was just following protocol for vandalism of public property." The words sounded hollow even to his own ears, and he trailed off as the chief held up a hand. Protocol. The chief's voice was deadly quiet. Show me where in the protocol it says to handcuff a 9-year-old child for picking flowers. Show me where it says to ignore a child's request to contact their parent. Show me where it says to traumatize a minor over a handful of daisies. The crowd had grown larger now, with people from nearby houses drawn by the commotion. Phones were still recording, capturing every word, every gesture. Someone in the back of the crowd was live streaming the whole thing. Everyone saw it. A woman called out from the crowd. He didn't even ask her name or give her a chance to explain. Just went straight for those handcuffs like she was some kind of dangerous criminal. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the onlookers. The chief looked around at the gathered crowd, his expression serious. I appreciate everyone's concern and assistance. Your video evidence will be crucial for what happens next. If anyone has footage from the beginning of this incident, please stay and provide your contact information to Officer Chen. Turning back to Keller, whose face had gone from pale to ashen, the chief continued, "Hand over your badge and gun." The words fell like hammer blows in the quiet park. "You're suspended, effective immediately, pending a full investigation." Officer Keller's hands shook as he removed his badge and weapon. "Sir, please, my career. I didn't know she was your daughter." As soon as the words left his mouth, he knew he'd made another mistake. The chief's eyes flashed. That's exactly the problem, isn't it? Would it have been okay if she had been someone else's daughter? Would it have been acceptable to handcuff any other 9-year-old child for picking flowers? An elderly man stepped forward from the crowd, leaning on his cane. "I've lived in this neighborhood for 40 years, he said, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "I've watched white kids pick these same flowers dozens of times. Never once saw any of them end up in handcuffs." The chief nodded slowly, acknowledging the man's words. "This isn't just about my daughter," he announced, addressing both Keller and the crowd. "This is about every child who's ever been treated unfairly because of the color of their skin. This is about power and how we use it. This is about trust and how easily it can be broken." Officer Keller had started crying now, the reality of his actions finally hitting him full force. His dream of being a police officer was crumbling before his eyes. But as he looked at the little girl being photographed by Officer Chen, at her small wrists with marks from his handcuffs, he realized he had no one to blame but himself. The chief's phone buzzed. It was his wife wondering why they weren't home yet for her birthday celebration. As he looked at the phone, then at his daughter, then at the scattered flowers on the ground, his expression softened slightly. "Someone once told me," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "that the true measure of power isn't how you use it against the strong, but how you use it to protect the vulnerable. Today, you failed that test in every possible way." The sun was starting to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the park. The flowers that had started this whole incident lay scabbard and wilting on the ground, a sad reminder of innocent intentions met with unnecessary force. As Officer Chen finished taking pictures and gathering statements, the chief's daughter walked back to her father. She stopped to pick up a few of the fallen flowers, salvaging what she could of her mother's birthday bouquet. It was a simple gesture, but it brought tears to the eyes of several onlookers. This child's resilience in the face of injustice was both beautiful and heartbreaking. "Let's go home," the chief said softly to his daughter, taking her hand. But before leaving, he turned one last time to Officer Keller. "Report to my office first thing tomorrow morning. We're going to review every arrest you've made, every ticket you've written, every interaction you've had. And if we find a pattern of what I think we're going to find." He left the sentence unfinished, but everyone understood the implications. As they walked away, the crowd began to disperse, but the impact of what they'd witnessed would linger long after the sun set on Riverside Heights Park. Social media was already buzzing with videos of the incident, and by nightfall, it would become more than just a local story. It would become a national conversation about power, prejudice, and the price of justice. The next morning, the police station was unusually quiet. Everyone had seen the videos. They'd gone viral overnight, with millions of views and thousands of comments. Officer Keller sat alone in the hallway outside the chief's office, staring at his hands. These same hands had put handcuffs on a little girl less than 24 hours ago. Inside the office, the chief sat reviewing footage from multiple sources: Keller's body camera, park security cameras, and videos from witnesses' phones. Each angle showed the same thing. An officer completely overstepping his authority and showing clear bias in his actions. The department's internal affairs officer sat beside the chief, taking notes as they watched. On the desk between them lay a thick folder, Officer Keller's complete record of arrests, citations, and civilian complaints over his 2 years on the force. "Play that body camera footage again," the chief said, his voice heavy. The video started from the moment Keller first spotted the little girl in the park. There was no warning, no attempt to talk to her first. The audio captured every word, including his daughter's polite request to call her father, a request that was completely ignored. "Look at these numbers," the internal affairs officer said, spreading out papers from the folder. "In the past 6 months alone, Keller has stopped and questioned 126 people. Over 80% were people of color. Most of these stops had no probable cause listed in the reports." The chief rubbed his temples, feeling the weight of not just his daughter's incident, but every unnecessary stop, every person who had faced unfair treatment. "He's been on the force 2 years, he said quietly. "How did we miss this pattern?" A knock on the door interrupted their review. It was Officer Chen, holding a stack of witness statements from the park. "Sir, you need to see these," he said, placing them on the desk. "We've got statements from regular park visitors. They're saying they've seen Keller targeting minority children and teenagers for weeks, especially around that same garden area." The chief picked up one statement that caught his eye. It was from the elderly man who had spoken up in the park, a retired judge who had lived in the neighborhood for decades. His statement detailed multiple instances of watching white children pick flowers without any police interaction, followed by his observations of Keller's different treatment of minority children. "Call him in," the chief said finally. Officer Chen opened the door and Keller walked in, looking like he hadn't slept all night. His usual confident stance was gone, replaced by slumped shoulders and nervous hands. The chief pointed to a chair. "Sit down." He pressed play on one of the videos, showing Keller his actions from multiple angles. "I want you to watch this and tell me exactly what you see." Keller's voice trembled as he watched himself on screen. I was wrong, sir. I should have." "Should have what?" The chief interrupted. "Should have asked her name. Should have listened when she tried to explain. Should have followed basic protocol for dealing with minors. Or should have just not assumed that a black child in a nice park must be doing something wrong." Tears started rolling down Keller's cheeks. "I didn't realize. I wasn't thinking about race. I was just trying to enforce the law." The chief leaned forward. "This isn't about one incident. This is about pattern and practice." He gestured to the spread of papers on his desk. "We've reviewed every stop you've made, every ticket you've written. The numbers tell a very clear story, Officer Keller. And it's not a story that has any place in modern policing." From somewhere in the building, they could hear phones ringing constantly. News outlets from across the country were calling, wanting statements about the viral video. Social media was exploding with debate about police reform and racial bias. The incident had struck a nerve, becoming a symbol of a much larger problem. "Do you know what my daughter asked me last night?" The chief said, his voice softening slightly. "She asked me if she did something wrong by picking those flowers." A 9-year-old child who was handcuffed for trying to do something nice for her mother's birthday is wondering if she did something wrong. Keller put his head in his hands. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm so sorry." "Sorry isn't enough," the chief replied. "Not this time." He pulled out an official document from his desk drawer. "Based on our investigation of this incident and our review of your record, we're recommending immediate termination. You'll have the right to a hearing, but given the evidence." The internal affairs officer stepped forward with another document. "We're also recommending a full review of all arrests and citations you've issued over the past 2 years. Any that show similar bias will be subject to investigation and possible legal action." Keller slumped in his chair, the reality of his situation finally hitting him full force. His actions hadn't just cost him his job, they had exposed deep-rooted biases he hadn't even recognized in himself. They had hurt innocent people, eroded community trust, and now everything he'd worked for was crumbling. Outside the office, the station was coming to life with the day shift. Officers walked past, some glancing through the glass at Keller with disappointment, others with anger. The incident had affected the entire department, making every officer question their own actions and biases. The chief stood up, signaling the end of the meeting. Take the next few days to prepare for your hearing. But understand this, what happened yesterday wasn't just about my daughter. It was about every child who's ever been unfairly targeted, every person who's been prejudged based on their appearance. Your actions have consequences, Officer Keller. It's time to face them. As Keller left the office, shoulders slumped and badge gone, the chief looked out his window at the community he had sworn to protect and serve. The incident with his daughter had opened old wounds, but maybe, just maybe, it could also be the catalyst for real change. 1 month after the incident at Riverside Heights Park, the community gathered in the same place where it all began. The flower garden, once the site of such injustice, had been transformed. New flowers bloomed everywhere, and a small sign stood near the entrance: Community Garden. Pick a flower, plant a flower, spread joy. The chief's daughter had come up with the idea herself. If everyone can pick flowers, she had told her father, then nobody will get in trouble for it. Her simple wisdom had touched everyone who heard it, and the city council had quickly approved the change. Today was special, not just because of the garden's reopening, but because of the changes it represented. The chief stood at a small podium, addressing the gathered crowd. Many familiar faces were there, including the elderly former judge and several witnesses from that fateful day. 1 month ago, the chief began, his voice carrying across the quiet park. Something happened here that opened our eyes. My daughter was handcuffed for picking flowers, an act that revealed deep problems we needed to face. Today, I'm not speaking as just the police chief, but as a father, a member of this community, and someone who believes in making things right. He gestured to a group of officers standing nearby. All of them wore new body cameras, part of the department's enhanced accountability measures. Every officer in our department has now completed intensive bias training. But more than that, we've changed how we approach our entire relationship with the community. The changes were significant. The department had created a new civilian oversight committee. They'd revised their protocols for interacting with minors. Regular community meetings were now mandatory for all officers. But perhaps most importantly, they'd implemented a comprehensive system to track and analyze all police interactions for potential bias. As for Officer Keller, the chief continued, addressing the question many had been wondering about. He was terminated from the force following a full investigation and hearing. But that's not the end of the story. He paused, looking out at the crowd. Keller has since enrolled in courses on racial bias and social justice. He's been speaking at police academies about his experience, helping new officers understand how unconscious bias can cloud judgment. The crowd murmured at this news. It wasn't the ending many had expected, but it showed something important: that real change was possible when people faced their mistakes and worked to do better. A group of children ran past the podium, laughing as they headed toward the garden. They were a mix of all races and backgrounds, carrying watering cans and small gardening tools. The community had embraced the new garden project fully, with families taking turns maintaining it and teaching their children about responsibility and sharing. But the biggest change, the chief said, smiling as he watched the children, came from listening to the wisdom of a 9-year-old girl. He turned to his daughter, who sat in the front row wearing a bright yellow dress similar to the one from that day. She told us that sometimes the answer isn't more rules or stricter enforcement. Sometimes it's about creating spaces where everyone feels welcome, where joy is meant to be shared. The chief's wife sat beside their daughter, holding a framed photo. It showed the wilted flowers her daughter had managed to save from that day, pressed and preserved as a reminder. What had started as a ruined birthday surprise had become a symbol of change and hope. Today, we're not just reopening a garden, the chief continued. We're celebrating a new approach to community policing. Every officer now carries garden seeds in their patrol car alongside their other equipment. When they see kids in the park, they're encouraged to stop and help them plant something beautiful. The crowd broke into applause as local children began handing out flower seeds to everyone present. The chief's daughter stood up and walked to the garden, where she carefully planted a yellow daisy, the same type she had tried to pick for her mother's birthday. A news crew captured the moment as people of all ages and backgrounds joined her, planting flowers together. The reporter would later call it a powerful symbol of community healing and transformation. As the planting ceremony continued, the chief stepped away from the podium to join his family. He watched as his daughter showed a younger child how to properly plant a seed, her confidence and kindness shining through despite everything she'd experienced. "You know what's funny, Daddy?" she said as he knelt beside her. "Now everyone can pick flowers, but nobody wants to. They'd rather plant them and watch them grow." Her observation brought tears to more than a few eyes in the crowd. The afternoon sun painted the park in warm colors, just like it had on that fateful day. But now, instead of witnessing injustice, it illuminated something beautiful, a community coming together, learning from its mistakes, and growing something new. Parents who had witnessed the original incident now brought their children to plant flowers and learn about community responsibility. Former critics of the police department worked alongside officers in maintaining the garden. What had started as a moment of injustice had blossomed into real, lasting change. As the sun began to set, the chief looked around at his transformed community. The garden was full of newly planted flowers, but more importantly, it was full of hope. Sometimes, he realized, the biggest changes start with the smallest moments, even something as simple as a little girl wanting to pick flowers for her mother's birthday.